During the Week 5 work package, we studied the discrimination against people of colour in the UK in relation to employment and housing opportunities. In particular, we looked at the Bristol Bus Boycott of 1963. Despite ongoing labour shortages, black workers were refused work within the British Omnibus Company for fears of public backlash and reduced profit. A protest group was formed by 4 men, Roy Hackett, Owen Henry, Audley Evans and Prince Brown, to raise awareness about the discrimination facing West Indians living in Bristol. 4 months of protesting, with support from Bristol University students, local MPs and Bristol civilians, eventually led to the colour bar being overturned and paved the way for Britain's Race Relations Act in 1965 and 1968. What interested us was the male-dominated nature of the topic. Whether it be the main activists involved in the organisation of the bus boycott, local MPs or supporters, there was little female mention. As seen in Figure 1 and 2, photos from the Bristol Bus Boycott mostly contain images of male protesters and key activists. Therefore, we started to question if and how women were involved in supporting the Bristol Bus Boycott. The main mention of women from our initial studies was through the common belief used to justify racial discrimination at the time, that white women would not be safe with black men driving the buses. Apart from this, there was not much information on how women were involved, either in supporting or standing against the boycott. Whilst we realised that the role of women was less prominent in that society, and that the first woman bus driver, Jill Viner, only started working in 1974, we wanted to expand our reading and explore the influence of women within Bristol society in 1963, something that seems to be left out of lots of academic resources.
As a starting point for finding out what role women played on the bus boycott, we thought that a simple Google search using questions such as "what role did women play on the bus boycott in 1963" may lead us to finding out the stories and names of women that were involved. Using this information, we may be able to build a bigger picture of the role of women, as we could use their names to find out their individual stories. What were their motivations? How did they affect the boycott? Why did they care? When doing a Google search together, we found articles from Bristol Live, Sky News and the Bristol Museum website, which we were then able to scan through and find names such as Barbara Dettering, who was an activist and social worker from the time of the boycott, and Rosa Parks, who had an external influence on the protest by inspiring people through her actions to promoting civil rights across the United States of America. By doing this search, it proved to us that something as simple as a Google search can be an effective method in opening up new lines of inquiry that could lead us to finding out more information about the question at hand. From this point, we thought another good starting point would be to look back at the Week 5 material that we'd been given about the bus boycott. Having a second look over this material made it to finding out information about the boycott that we had missed previously. We looked through the old newspaper articles from the time of the boycott, but it became to no avail. There is no mention of any women in the articles. Despite not leading us closer to our answer, this was a useful exercise as it made us more interested as to why women aren't mentioned in the literature. Were any women even involved? How can we find out who these women were and how they impacted the boycott? Returning to Google allowed us to find more old articles which more significantly mention women's role on the boycott. This led us to articles that mentioned Ina Hackett, who was the wife of Roy Hackett, the lead organiser for the boycott. Ina Hackett herself was turned down from a job as a bus conductor despite meeting all the requirements. Finding out her name and story proved to us that using old newspaper articles can be a useful way of opening up new lines of inquiry about the boycott.
Once we analysed information such as photos and articles provided, and had found a number of key names that we could begin our main lines of inquiry through, we questioned the role of women closely linked to the boycott, namely the wives and close relatives of the key protesters. We wanted to know if they were supportive or influential in key events. For example, in researching Ray Hackett's wife Ina, we found that she was turned down from the bus company, despite being qualified, yet was still turned down because of her skin colour. We can follow up through primary interviews with individuals involved and their surviving relatives. This will ascertain the level of their engagement and influence in the protests that they had. This will ascertain the level of their engagement and the influence over the protests that they held. The result of this will be that we will be able to see how much wider support people such as Ray Hackett had, and the influence women had over decisions made by boycotters. We continued following lines of inquiry based on names and photos provided in the module. We will do this through further interviews and analysis of photos to give us an understanding of photographers and journalists covering the protests. We will be able to look at archived information such as notes from reports in local newspapers and through the personal records of journalists and photographers, or rather their surviving relatives. This line of inquiry would be useful to follow in looking at female engagement with the Bristol University student protests. Studying the sourced photo, we found that all the student protesters were male. In order to discover more about the role and influence of women in the protests, we will go through archived information, such as student newspapers, that would be likely to give information on people involved. This will enable us to conduct further interviews with those involved and their families to understand their level of involvement and question the role of women involved, indeed if there were any. This will help us look at the role of women in protest generally. We will be able to look at factors such as university political society membership of protesters and ascertain whether women were politically active in the time, and so would be more likely to be involved in protests, or if a lack of female representation in the photos is symptomatic of a wider lack of political engagement by women at the time.
From there, we decided to look at academic articles to see if they offered any insight into women's roles in the Bristol Bus Boycott. Interestingly, many of the articles we found documenting the Bristol Bus Boycott were written by female researchers and historians. For instance, Madge Dresser attempts to provide a fair and objective account of the social history of the time, and bear witness to the experience of both black and white historians. Reading her article, titled Black and White on the Buses, we discovered that in 1962, Roy Hackett's wife, Ina Hackett, applied for a job as a bus conductress and was also turned down, despite the workforce shortages. One reason we may have not discovered this earlier could be that even official statistics underestimated unemployment, especially amongst married women, and so Ina Hackett was largely overlooked despite being at the forefront of the movement. Claire Mansour discusses how the Bristol Bus Boycott was inspired by the civil rights movement in America, particularly in Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat. She notes that Paul Stevenson, a leader in organising the boycott, remarked in an interview in November 2005 that without Rosa Parks, I'm not sure whether we would have embarked on our boycott. I thought if she could protest by not giving up her seat on a bus, we could start a bus boycott.
Watching the virtual walking tour of Bristol Harbour on YouTube allowed us to gain a sense of Bristol as a place. For example, passing the Dockland area allows one to imagine the work that was completed here, and walking across the city illustrates the areas where the Bristol Bus Boycott occurred. This helped us to realise that collecting primary data from Bristol was vital to understand the influence of women. Firstly, we looked at the Bristol Museum's website, where it states that the boycott has helped change Bristol and Britain forever, but there is little mention of women, so visiting these locations is key. The M Shed is located by the floating harbour and contains galleries revolving around people, life and places within Bristol. Therefore, visiting museums is key to develop a greater understanding of the events that occurred in the bus boycott, as well as any female figures that were involved, depicted through resources such as the mural of Barbara Dettering displayed on the slideshow. Additionally, interviewing relatives such as Roy Hackett's daughters or Barbara Dettering, who states, "I was one of the silent diggers," will further aid our research through personal stories and allowing us to understand the emotional connections that women have to the Bristol Bus Boycott. Therefore, this helps us to understand and answer how influential women were.
In summary, by following this line of inquiry, we feel as though we have developed a more in-depth understanding of women's influence in the Bristol Bus Boycott. Initially, we conducted a broad Google search and revisited the Week 5 material. Both of these appeared very male-dominated, leading us to question why there was such an absence of women in the story of the Bristol Bus Boycott. We then researched old newspaper articles and discovered women such as Ina Hackett, who we researched further. Following on from this, we looked at several academic articles written by women, such as Madge Dresser, which were useful in providing qualitative and quantitative data about the bus boycott. Finally, we would have followed up on this by collecting primary data, by interviewing women and relatives involved in the boycott and visiting Bristol's museums.